Hello everyone, before we begin tonight's haunting tale, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a moment of the fear. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time the unknown feels closest to you. The storm howled outside, its fury pressing against the glass like a forgotten soul desperate to be freed. Rain lashed in sheets, blurring the world beyond the window of the vintage sleeper train, where the light from the flickering lamps cast long, ghostly shadows across the narrow corridor. The rhythmic clatter of the train's wheels over the metal tracks was the only sound that filled the cabin, a steady, mechanical lullaby against the backdrop of nature's wrath. Inside, the air was heavy with an eerie stillness, broken only by the occasional creak of wood or the distant murmur of a frightened voice. The train, a relic from another time, seemed to groan and shift as if it were alive, unwilling to submit to the storm outside. Its tarnished brass fittings, the worn velvet seats, and the faint smell of dust and mildew clung to the air like memories long past their prime. The passengers, cloaked in their own thoughts, shifted uneasily in their seats. Their eyes darted from window to window, as if expecting something or someone to emerge from the darkness. The train's soft, constant movement had a hypnotic quality, but tonight it felt different. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence thicker. Gideon Drake sat alone in his compartment, his back pressed against the cold leather seat. His sharp eyes, the color of storm clouds themselves, were fixated on the flickering candle on the table before him. The light flickered, casting shadows across his lined face, a face that had seen too many things it couldn't forget. He'd been many things in his life: detective, investigator, a man who once thrived on the pursuit of truth. But now, he was nothing but a shadow of his former self. His fingers idly traced the rim of his glass, but he wasn't drinking. His mind wandered, pulling him into the past. He could still hear the voice of that woman, the one he had failed to save, echoing in his mind. He had been so sure he could solve the case, so certain that the truth would be revealed in time. But it hadn't. Instead, she had disappeared without a trace, and Gideon had been left to live with the bitter taste of failure. The storm outside seemed to echo his internal turmoil. He stared out the window, watching the flashes of lightning reveal fleeting glimpses of the desolate mountain range they were traveling through. His eyes narrowed as a shiver ran down his spine. The landscape, empty and unforgiving, felt like a perfect reflection of his own solitude. But there was more than just his regrets haunting him tonight. Something about the train, something about this journey, felt wrong. The longer he sat here, the more the hairs on the back of his neck prickled with an unsettling sensation, as if something were watching him, or waiting. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought. It was just the storm playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. Across the corridor, Vivian Hart flipped through an old journal, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was a historian, but this wasn't research for any ordinary project. She had a knack for uncovering hidden truths, the kind of truths most people were better off not knowing. She had been fascinated by the idea of forgotten histories and lost knowledge ever since she was young. And this train, this ancient relic, was her next puzzle to solve. Vivian had heard the rumors before she boarded, that this train wasn't just a means of transportation but a link to something far darker. Some said it had been cursed, others claimed it was a gateway to another world. Most dismissed it as superstition. But Vivian had learned long ago that the truth often lay hidden beneath layers of myths and half-truths. And there was something about this train that called to her, something ancient and almost alive. Her fingers paused on a page, and her gaze drifted to the window. Lightning illuminated the storm outside, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw a figure standing on the tracks. A flash of movement. But when she blinked, the figure was gone. She leaned forward, pressing her face to the glass. Nothing. Only the rain and the darkened landscape stretching endlessly ahead. She sighed, leaning back in her seat. The storm was getting worse, and the train felt as though it were being carried away by the wind itself. The rhythmic thumping of the wheels against the tracks, once comforting, now felt ominous. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for them, something hidden just beyond the veil of the storm. Her thoughts were interrupted by the faintest sound, a soft creaking. She looked around, her eyes narrowing. It came from the corridor. She stood, her curiosity piqued. She stepped into the dimly lit hallway, glancing in both directions. Empty. But as she turned back toward her compartment, a slip of paper fluttered down from the ceiling and landed at her feet. Vivian picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly. The note was brief, scrawled in jagged handwriting. "The train is not what it seems." She turned the note over, but there was nothing else. No name. No explanation. Just that cryptic warning. Her heart began to race, but she quickly forced herself to calm down. This was just some joke. A prank by one of the other passengers, perhaps. Still, a chill ran down her spine as she looked around the empty corridor. The storm outside raged louder now, but all she could hear inside the train was the faint whisper of something else, something unspoken. Gavin Moore stumbled into the corridor, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. He was new to this job, his first week as a train guard, and already he was questioning his decision to accept the assignment. The storm was bad, worse than anything he'd seen before, and the train felt like it was on the edge of falling apart. He had already checked the windows twice to make sure they were secure, and he kept finding himself glancing nervously over his shoulder, as if something might be lurking just out of view. He wasn't sure if it was the storm or something else, but the train had a strange energy to it tonight. The air felt thick, as though it were closing in on him. He couldn't quite explain it, but there was a gnawing sensation in his gut that something was horribly wrong. When he reached the end of the hall, he found Vivian standing there, staring at the note in her hand. Her brow was furrowed, and her lips were pressed together as though she were deep in thought. "Is everything all right?" Gavin asked, his voice hesitant. Vivian turned toward him, her eyes intense. She held up the note, her fingers tightening around it. "I found this. Do you know anything about it?" Gavin glanced at the paper and swallowed. No, I don't." But he paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "There's something about this train. Something that doesn't sit right with me." Vivian raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" Gavin hesitated. "I don't know. It's hard to explain. The storm's one thing, but the way the train moves, the way the lights flicker, it feels like it's alive, like it's pulling us somewhere we're not supposed to be." Vivian's eyes narrowed, studying him. "That's exactly how I feel. Like we're part of something bigger than just this train ride." Gavin swallowed again, his hands beginning to shake. "I don't know how much longer I can keep it together, Vivian. Something's going to happen. I can feel it." Before she could respond, a loud thud echoed from one of the compartments further down the hall, followed by a muffled scream. Both of them froze. What was that? Gavin's voice was barely audible. "I don't know," Vivian said, her heart racing. "But we need to find out." As they moved toward the source of the sound, Gideon's voice echoed through their minds. "What would you do if you were in their shoes? Would you trust the strangers around you? Would you investigate the source of the scream, knowing it could lead you into danger? Or would you ignore it, hoping the nightmare would pass you by?" The train continued to roll through the storm, its destination unknown. The storm outside had intensified, a relentless assault on the train that seemed to push it further into the unknown. The train's lamps flickered and dimmed with every flash of lightning, casting long, distorted shadows along the narrow hallways. Each creak of the old wooden walls, each gust of wind that howled through the cracks, seemed to whisper some terrible secret, one the train itself was desperate to hide. Gavin Moore's heart pounded in his chest as he and Vivian hurried down the corridor, their footsteps muffled by the hum of the train's constant motion. His hands trembled, the paper from the cryptic note still clutched in his sweaty palms. He had heard the scream, sharp, desperate, and unmistakable, and now the silence that followed felt even worse. Every shadow felt like it was alive, watching them as they moved further into the heart of the train. He stole a glance at Vivian, her expression tense, determined, but even she couldn't shake the fear in her eyes. "I don't like this," Gavin muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the rumble of the storm. Vivian didn't respond at first, her focus narrowed as she surveyed the darkened passage. She had always prided herself on being able to see patterns, to unearth the hidden truths that others couldn't or wouldn't look for. But this felt different. It felt wrong. Something on this train was pushing them, pulling them into a trap, and she had no idea how to escape it. They reached the compartment where the scream had come from. It was at the very end of the car, a small room with an open door that creaked in the wind, its interior cloaked in shadow. The scent of stale air and dust wafted toward them as they peered inside. The room was empty. At first glance, it seemed harmless enough, just a quiet, dimly lit space with a few scattered belongings. But the air was thick with unease, heavy with an energy that hadn't been there moments before. Gavin stepped into the room cautiously, scanning every corner. What happened to the person who was in here? Vivian's eyes fell on the small bed in the corner, its rumpled sheets the only sign of recent activity. A small silver pendant lay on the floor near the foot of the bed. Vivian picked it up carefully, turning it over in her hands. The pendant was in the shape of an eye, intricate and detailed, its surface glinting strangely in the low light. It felt cold to the touch, colder than it should have been, as if it had been abandoned for much longer than it appeared. Maybe they dropped it in a hurry, Gavin suggested, though his voice quivered with uncertainty. Maybe they left because they were scared. But then, where did they go? Vivian frowned, pocketing the pendant. I don't know, Gavin. Something tells me they didn't just leave. Whatever's going on here, it's not just fear. A sudden, violent thud from above interrupted their conversation. Both of them froze, eyes wide. A muffled cry, almost lost in the storm's roar, reached their ears, followed by another thud. This time it was unmistakable, the sound of something, or someone, falling. Without a word, they ran toward the stairs leading up to the upper deck, the hairs on the back of Gavin's neck standing up. Every step felt heavier, as though the train itself was resisting their movement, pushing them back into the dark. Gideon Drake sat in his compartment, staring out the window, the storm outside creating a disorienting blur of lights and shadow. His reflection flickered across the glass like a ghost, but it wasn't his image he was studying. He was watching something else. Something moving in the distance, just beyond the train's reach. For the past few minutes, Gideon had felt the unease grow stronger. It started as a low hum, a strange, magnetic pull that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of the train. At first, he thought it was just his imagination playing tricks, but now, with the storm raging outside, he could feel it for what it truly was. The feeling of something, or someone, moving closer, just outside the realm of his perception. His hand reached instinctively for his old leather bag, the one he had carried on every investigation he'd ever worked. It was full of tools, of course, flashlight, magnifying glass, notebooks, but it also held something deeper. A sense of purpose. Something he hadn't felt in years. The storm was making it harder to see anything beyond the window, but he could feel the train's rhythm faltering. There was a jagged, unnatural quality to the way the train swayed now, as though it was no longer following the tracks but rather gliding through some unseen force. He stood up abruptly and moved to the door. His heart quickened. There was no more time for hesitation. As Gideon stepped into the corridor, the atmosphere had shifted. The air was thick with something unseen, something oppressive. It wasn't just the storm outside, it was something within the train itself. Something had changed, something had stirred. The sound of footsteps echoed ahead of him, Vivian and Gavin, both of whom had clearly been on the move for some time now. Gideon followed their trail, his senses heightened, each creak and groan of the train sending a wave of unease through him. The flickering lamps made the hall feel even narrower, the shadows clinging to the corners, as though the darkness was trying to swallow them whole. Vivian turned sharply at the sound of his footsteps, her face pale but determined. Gideon, you need to see this. He didn't ask for details. He followed her silently as she led him into the same compartment. The bed was undisturbed, but the presence of the pendant told him all he needed to know. The passenger who had been here was no longer in their seat. They had vanished. What are we dealing with? He asked, his voice low, as though the question might summon some dark answer from the shadows. Vivian shook her head, but the tension in her eyes spoke volumes. I don't know. But I don't think it's just a missing person. I think we're being tested. Tested? Gavin repeated, his voice cracking. By what? By something that had already started to make its move. The next few hours blurred together in a series of unsettling moments and unanswered questions. Every new discovery led to more confusion, more dread. A woman's purse was found in the bathroom, but there was no sign of her. A note left on a table read, "Run, or it will take you too." The lights flickered once again, this time plunging the train into darkness for several seconds. When the lights returned, the passengers in the car had shifted, their faces pale, their eyes wide with terror, as if they had seen something they couldn't explain. Gavin couldn't take it anymore. "What are we supposed to do?" he demanded. "Every time we think we're getting closer, something else happens." Vivian placed a hand on his arm, trying to steady him, but her own fingers were trembling. She knew the answer, even if she didn't want to admit it. "We keep moving forward. We have no choice." They reached the train's conductor, but he was no help. He looked just as bewildered as the rest of them, muttering about malfunctioning systems and an old legend about the train. But then the temperature in the car plummeted. No explanation. No warning. Just a cold, biting wind that filled the air like the breath of some unseen creature. "I can't do this anymore," Gavin whispered, his eyes wide with panic. "Something's not right. I feel it. We're not alone. We never were." As they stood together, each lost in their own thoughts, the train seemed to shift again, pulling them deeper into the storm. With each passing second, the distance between them and safety grew wider. There was no way to escape this journey now. But why had they been chosen? Why this train? Gideon's voice cut through the silence like a knife. "What would you do if you were in their shoes? Would you trust what little is left of your sanity? Or would you let the shadows swallow you whole?" As the train hurtled toward the unknown, one thing became clear. Whatever was waiting for them at the end of the line would force them to confront their deepest fears, their darkest secrets, and the very limits of their humanity. And none of them were ready. The train's rhythmic hum had faded into an eerie silence, and Gideon Drake stood in the middle of the narrow corridor, gazing down the darkened path ahead. The air was thick, heavy with an oppressive presence that seemed to pulse with every beat of his heart. He could almost hear it, the faintest whisper of something just beyond the veil, something that had been there all along but only now made itself known. A harsh gust of wind howled through the cracked window at the end of the car, rattling the glass as if trying to warn them. His eyes, shadowed with a weariness that came from years of investigation, narrowed. This wasn't just another case. No, this felt different. The walls themselves seemed to be closing in around them, and he knew they were running out of time. Vivian Hart moved cautiously behind him, her footsteps steady but purposeful. The historian in her was piecing together the fragments of history that tied this train to something much darker, something older. Every cryptic note, every vanishing passenger, every strange symbol they had uncovered over the past few hours, it was all starting to make sense. And yet, the pieces didn't form a clear picture. They were just as broken as the passengers themselves. "What do you think is happening here?" Gavin Moore's voice came from behind them, shaky and unsure, but there was a strength in it now, a hard edge that hadn't been there before. Gideon turned to see the rookie train guard standing there, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. But there was something else in his gaze now, determination. "I don't know, Gavin," Gideon replied quietly, his voice a mixture of frustration and fear. "But we need to find out fast, before we become part of the mystery." They had been chasing shadows since they boarded the train, shadowy figures in the corners of their vision, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, and passengers who had vanished as though they had never existed. But now, something had shifted. It wasn't just strange, it was deadly. Gavin's hands trembled as he held up another note. The paper was crumpled, stained with dark splotches, and the words scrawled across it were a cryptic warning: "The doors are closing. You can't outrun it." "What does that even mean?" Gavin asked, his voice raw with anxiety. Vivian stepped forward, her eyes scanning the words. "It's not a warning. It's a challenge," she said, her tone grim. "The train, this place, it's not just a vehicle for transportation. It's a trap." A shiver ran down Gideon's spine. He had thought it, too, but hearing Vivian speak the words made it all the more real. The train was alive in ways they hadn't understood yet. It was a force unto itself, a labyrinth of darkness that fed off their fear and confusion. Suddenly, a scream ripped through the air, echoing from the car ahead. A guttural, terrified scream that stopped them all in their tracks. Without a word, They rushed toward the sound, their hearts racing. They reached the next car in seconds, only to be met with an even more chilling sight. The car was empty, completely, eerily empty. The seats were overturned, scattered across the floor as though a struggle had taken place, but there was no sign of the passengers. No sign of anything. Where did they go? Gavin whispered, stepping cautiously into the room, his voice shaking. It's like they were just erased. Vivian looked at the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Nothing seemed out of place, but everything felt wrong. The air was stifling, the silence suffocating. It was as if the very essence of this car had been altered. Gideon's eyes scanned the room, searching for something, anything, that could offer an explanation. It was then that he noticed it. At the far end of the car, in the corner near the window, was a small door, one that hadn't been there before. It was barely visible, hidden behind a curtain of shadows. But as his gaze locked onto it, he knew they had to investigate it. Vivian, Gavin, he muttered, his voice taut. This is where it leads. This is where we end up. The door opened with a creak, revealing a narrow, dimly lit stairwell that descended into the bowels of the train. The air grew colder as they stepped into the darkness, the storm's fury muffled behind the thick walls of the train. Where are we going? Gavin asked, his voice barely above a whisper, the fear in his eyes now overtaken by curiosity and a sense of resignation. We don't have a choice, Gideon said grimly. We have to see this through. They descended the stairs in silence, each of them aware that they were no longer in control. The train was pulling them deeper into something they couldn't fully understand. It was like an unseen hand guiding their every move, forcing them into the center of the storm. The bottom of the stairs opened into a large, dimly lit chamber. It looked like an old storage room, dusty crates stacked haphazardly along the walls, shelves lined with forgotten trinkets. But in the center of the room was a single object that stood out, a large, ornate mirror, its surface framed by intricate carvings that seemed to pulse with a faint light. Vivian stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the mirror. What is this? Before Gideon could answer, a chill ran through him. The mirror seemed to reflect more than just their images. It reflected them, their deepest fears, their darkest memories. Gavin recoiled, taking a step back. That thing, it's not just a mirror, he said, his voice trembling. It's watching us. The reflection in the mirror began to change. It flickered and shifted, like a broken television screen, revealing images of passengers long gone. Faces twisted in terror, eyes wide with unspoken horror. And in the reflection of the room, a shadow moved slowly, deliberately, like a predator stalking its prey. The temperature in the room plummeted. The light from the storm outside faded, and the train seemed to groan in protest, as if something was shifting beneath them, something vast and unyielding. Gideon felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. There's something here with us, Vivian whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing roar of the storm. A voice, low and menacing, echoed from the darkness beyond the mirror. You shouldn't have come here. Gavin's eyes widened in panic. We're not going to make it out, are we? Gideon's grip tightened on the edge of the crate as the mirror's surface rippled. The train was no longer just a means of transport. It had become the heart of something far darker, something ancient, something that had been waiting for them. Waiting for all of them. And then the mirror shattered. As the glass fractured, the room erupted in chaos. A cold wind whipped through the chamber, and the sound of the train's engines screeched in protest. Shadows began to materialize from the cracks, twisting and warping like smoke in the air. They were everywhere now, surrounding them, closing in from every direction. Gideon took a step back, his mind racing. The entity that had haunted them, had been leading them, was here, in full force. They had crossed a threshold. There was no turning back. In the final moments of clarity, before the room was swallowed by darkness, Gideon understood. The train wasn't a trap set by some malevolent force. It was a test of humanity's will to survive, a test to see who would break first, who would succumb to the shadows, and who would face the ultimate choice. He turned to the others, his voice steady but filled with an unshakable truth. It's not about escaping. It's about whether we can fight back. We have to face it, or we'll become part of its cycle. The train was no longer just a mode of transportation, it was a living, breathing entity, one that pulsed with an ancient malevolence. Every door seemed to trap them further inside its labyrinth, and every window revealed only an ever-deepening storm. The shadows had taken on a life of their own, creeping through the walls, seeping into the cracks of their minds. Gideon Drake stood at the heart of the train's most imposing chamber, a vast, hollow room filled with nothing but darkness and echoes. The train's groaning, whirring sound had long since faded into a deafening silence. He could feel it in his bones, the cold, clammy grip of something ancient and unspeakable. Something that had been waiting for them, testing them, all along. Vivian Hart stood beside him, her face pale, eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and fear. Her fingers clenched the edge of the metal railing, knuckles white as she gazed at the darkness in front of them. The once collective air of scholarly curiosity had shifted into something much darker. She had hoped, at first, that there was a logical explanation for everything, but now she understood the truth. The train, this endless night, was not a mere puzzle. It was a predator, and they were the prey. Gavin Moore, the rookie train guard who had barely held on to his resolve through the initial disappearances and cryptic notes, was visibly shaken. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his hands trembling as he gripped a flashlight. He glanced around nervously, as if expecting something to leap out of the shadows at any moment. But it wasn't just the shadows he feared anymore, it was the emptiness itself. Gideon turned to face them. His face was etched with years of guilt and loss, but now there was a hardness in his eyes. He had spent years chasing ghosts, unraveling mysteries, and confronting the shadows of the past. But this was something different. This wasn't just a case, it was a reckoning. "It's not just trying to kill us," Gideon said, his voice low but steady. "It's testing us." Vivian stepped closer, her voice strained with both fear and determination. "Testing us? For what?" Gideon didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the far end of the room. There, standing in the middle of the pitch-black darkness, was a figure. A silhouette that seemed to flicker, as if it was both there and not there at the same time. "It knows we're here," Gideon murmured. "And it's giving us a choice." A chill ran through Vivian's spine as she followed his gaze. The figure stepped forward, the darkness seeming to part before it. It was no longer just a shadow, it was a presence. Tall, angular, its form blurred and shifting, as though it was composed of something far more insidious than flesh or bone. "Who are you?" Gavin demanded, his voice cracking. "What do you want from us?" The figure remained silent for a moment, the tension in the air palpable, before a voice, cold and distant, filled the room. "We are the passage between worlds," the voice said, echoing unnaturally from all directions. "We are the judges of souls. You are here, on this train, because you have been chosen." Gideon's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just some entity, they weren't just trapped in some twisted version of reality. This was something much worse. "What do you mean by chosen?" Vivian asked, her voice tight with fear, but laced with an undeniable curiosity. The figure's form seemed to waver, flickering like the dying embers of a fire. "You are here because you have failed," it said, its voice cold and contemptuous. "Your lives, your actions, have been weighed. You are here to prove your worth. If you succeed, you may leave. If you fail, you will become part of the cycle." Gavin took a step back, shaking his head. "What cycle? What do you mean fail? We haven't done anything." "Exactly." The figure's voice grew more insistent. "You have not faced the darkness within yourselves. The shadows you see now are merely reflections of the darkness in your hearts. Only by confronting your deepest fears, your greatest regrets, can you break free." The room grew colder still, the temperature dropping rapidly, until each breath felt like it was coming from an icy cavern. The walls began to close in on them, as if the train itself was constricting, narrowing the space around them, pushing them closer to the figure. "I'm not afraid," Gavin said, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "I'm not. You lie to yourself." The figure's voice hissed. "You are all afraid. You are afraid of the truth." The shadows surrounding the room began to swirl, taking on new forms, images of things long buried. Gideon's eyes locked onto a figure in the corner, a woman with a pale, lifeless face. She was looking at him, But it wasn't just a face, it was the face of his guilt, his regrets, his failure. A sharp pain sliced through Gideon's chest. He recognized the face. It was Lena, his partner. The one he couldn't save. The one whose death had haunted him for years. He had failed her. He hadn't been able to save her. And now, her ghost was staring at him, accusing him. Vivian's expression faltered as a similar image appeared before her, a younger version of herself, standing on the threshold of a long-abandoned house. The words "do not enter" were written in blood, and the child looked lost, alone, and terrified. Gavin's flashlight flickered, and a dark silhouette appeared before him. It was his younger self, standing alone in the middle of an empty train station. The air was thick with fear, the world around him twisted, as though it was both familiar and foreign. He had always been afraid of being alone, and this was his ultimate fear. Each of them was faced with their own demons, their own darkest fears and regrets. And they couldn't run from it anymore. Gideon swallowed hard, his throat dry as the figure's gaze turned to him. "You failed her," the voice whispered, barely audible above the growing roar of the train's wheels. "I know," Gideon muttered, his voice tight, the weight of his failure settling over him like a suffocating fog. "I know." The figure's form shifted, and suddenly, they were back in the cold, hollow room. The shadows had receded, but the air still felt heavy, thick with their personal demons. The entity, or whatever it was silent for a moment, then it spoke again, its voice low and ominous. "Your choice is simple. Face the darkness and overcome it, or become part of the cycle. But know this, you cannot escape." Gideon's pulse quickened. This was it. The moment he had feared had arrived. But the voice inside his head, the one that had once driven him to solve cases, to chase answers, now told him something different. They could escape. They could fight. "We won't be part of your cycle," Gideon said, his voice rising with newfound strength. "We won't become shadows. We'll face the darkness head-on." Vivian stepped forward, her eyes alight with a defiant fire. "You think you can break us? You think we'll fall for this twisted game? We are human, and we are stronger than you." Gavin, despite his fear, stood tall beside them. "We're not afraid anymore. We'll face whatever you throw at us." The figure's shadowy form flickered, trembling with rage. It didn't expect this. It didn't expect them to fight back. "Then face the consequences," it hissed. The air exploded in a burst of white-hot energy, and the train around them seemed to warp and twist, as if reality itself was cracking apart. The three of them were thrown to the ground, their bodies racked with pain, their minds swirling in confusion. But through the pain, they held on to one thing: their resolve. The train slowed, the screech of the brakes breaking the eerie silence that had filled the air for what seemed like hours. Gideon Drake's heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing the remnants of the battle they had just fought. The shadows, the entity, had retreated, but only for a moment. The storm outside raged on, its fury now sounding like a distant whisper compared to the oppressive stillness within the train. The three of them stood in the darkened corridor, their bodies bruised and exhausted from their physical and psychological battles. Gideon, Vivian, and Gavin were no longer the same people who had boarded this train days ago. Each of them had faced the darkest corners of their souls, and somehow they had survived. But the air between them was thick with uncertainty, with lingering doubt. Had they really escaped? Had they really broken the cycle? Vivian ran a trembling hand through her hair, her expression unreadable. "It's over," she whispered, though the words sounded hollow even to her. They had defeated the figure, the source of their torment, and yet, something about the silence felt more menacing than the storm had ever been. She looked down at the note she still clutched in her hand, the cryptic message from the entity. "The cycle is broken, for now." For now, Gavin's voice was barely audible, but the dread in his tone cut through the silence like a blade. "What does that mean? Are we really free?" Gideon turned away from them, his eyes narrowing as he studied the hallway. The train had begun to slow, its deceleration more pronounced now, the harsh screech of the metal against metal reverberating in the stillness. The distant sound of the wheels on the tracks seemed like the train was on the verge of coming to a halt, but something in the way it felt, an unsettling stillness in the air, told him they weren't done yet. This wasn't over. He had spent years chasing shadows, unraveling cases, confronting the darkest corners of the human psyche. But this was something else entirely. The entity had never truly left. It had tested them, torn them apart, and forced them to confront their deepest fears. But what if it had been preparing them for something else? Something worse? Gavin's flashlight flickered, casting long, jagged shadows on the walls. Gideon. His voice cracked, full of both fear and confusion. What if this isn't really over? What if we're still in it? What if we never left? Gideon didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out the nearest window, his gaze fixed on the dark landscape beyond. The storm was still swirling, heavy clouds blotting out the moonlight, but there was something strange about the view. The scenery seemed wrong. The shapes of trees were distorted, the ground uneven and twisted in unnatural ways. He could feel it, the unsettling pull of something waiting just beyond the edge of his vision. Something lurking, just out of reach. His heart skipped a beat. "Gideon," Vivian said, her voice breaking the silence. "What is it? What do you see?" His lips parted, but the words seemed to lodge themselves in his throat, stuck between a lifetime of guilt and the realization that they had never truly escaped. He felt something in the pit of his stomach, a cold, gnawing sensation. He had seen it before. The edges of reality were bending, twisting, as though the train was not just a vehicle but a prison. A prison that they had no guarantee of escaping. What if? Gideon started, then stopped himself. He couldn't voice the thought, not yet. Not until he understood what was happening. "I don't know," he finally muttered, his voice low and uncertain. "But I don't think we're free." Vivian stepped forward, her brow furrowed in disbelief. "What do you mean?" "We've beaten it. We've broken the cycle. The entity, it's gone. We're safe." She wanted to believe it. They all did. But Gideon's silence, the way he stared at the window as if he could see through the storm, told her that his doubts weren't so easily shaken. She walked over to him, her fingers brushing his arm, but he didn't flinch. He didn't move. "I don't think we're free," Gideon repeated, his voice tight with the weight of the words. "I think we've only just begun to understand what this place is. The cycle, it's not just a punishment. It's a test." Gavin shifted nervously, his eyes darting to the nearest exit. "A test? But why? What's the point? What do they want from us?" Gideon shook his head, his thoughts racing. "I don't know yet. But I know this isn't over." There was a sudden, sharp click, and the doors at the far end of the corridor swung open with a loud creak. The three of them froze, the hairs on the back of their necks standing on end. They hadn't touched the door. They hadn't done anything to trigger it. Yet it opened, as if by some unseen hand, beckoning them into the unknown. "I think we're being called," Gideon said, his voice thick with unease. "We have to go." Vivian hesitated for a long moment, her gaze flickering between Gideon and Gavin. She wanted to refuse, to turn away from whatever fresh horror lay beyond that door. But something in her heart, something deep and ancient, compelled her to step forward. "We have to face this," she said quietly, her voice trembling but resolute. "We can't keep running." Gavin swallowed hard, but he followed them, his steps shaky but determined. Together, they stepped through the door. Beyond it was a long, narrow passage, darker than any part of the train they had seen before. The walls were lined with old, faded paintings, the faces in them twisted and warped, as if they had been altered by time or by something far darker. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and dust, and the soft hum of the train seemed to fade away altogether, replaced by an eerie, almost suffocating silence. As they walked deeper into the passage, the walls seemed to narrow, closing in around them. The only light now came from the faint glow of their flashlights, but even that seemed to falter as the darkness thickened, pressing in on them. "Is this?" Vivian whispered, her voice strained. "Is this the end? Or is it just another part of the game?" "We're not playing anymore," Gideon said firmly, his eyes narrowing. "This is real. We're not going to be part of the cycle. Not again." A sudden sound echoed through the passage, a distant, haunting cry, followed by the faint rustling of something moving through the darkness. Their hearts raced, the weight of their fear sinking deep into their bones. Without warning, the lights went out. Complete darkness surrounded them, swallowing everything whole. What now? Gavin's voice was barely audible, trembling with fear. Gideon's breath quickened, his thoughts spiraling. This wasn't part of the plan. They couldn't fight against something that was everywhere, that controlled everything. This wasn't just a test. This was it. The final judgment. They had failed before, and now it was time for the final reckoning. A low voice filled the air, echoing around them, reverberating through the walls, the floor, the very air they breathed. "You cannot escape," it said, cold and distant. "You are mine now." For a moment, they stood frozen in the darkness, the weight of the words hanging over them like a guillotine, ready to fall. But then, through the haze of fear and doubt, a spark ignited within Gideon. A spark of defiance. He would not let it end this way. "We'll see about that," he whispered, his voice steady despite the terror that gripped him. But as they prepared to face whatever waited, one thing was certain: the shadows were not done with them yet. They had merely let them believe they were free.